Hello everyone, my name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, and we're pleased today to be here at the Canadian Parliament for the Canadian launch of the 2024 Global Terrorism Index, which is put together by the Australian-based think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace. Around the world, we see terrorism occurring on many continents with a human rights impact on the people targeted by this violence. Canada has seen the Hamas attack against Israel on October 7th, and how that has had an impact in our own society, how it's led to radicalization, hate on our streets. So the point to be said is that anything that happens internationally can come and impact Canada domestically. And we have to take counterterrorism work seriously. We must do what we can to work with the United Nations to help countries that are suffering the brunt of terrorism, particularly in parts of Africa and the Sahel, places that are members of the Francophonie, of which Canada is a member of. We really need to look at the world and look at what's happening and look at the trends and patterns of political violence by non-state actors to try to come up with better policies to help protect human rights and actually help our key allies in many parts of the world. We're here today to actually, with distinguished experts, to give more information about what's happening. Canadians need to know what's happening. We're an open country. We have diaspora groups that connect us to every single country in the world. Therefore, we have to be strategic. We have to think about terrorism as not an issue that fades away if we defeat a group in Iraq or Syria, but something that continues and must be dealt with vigilance and with care and given the resources to counter this, be it in Africa or the Middle East or Afghanistan or here domestically. With that being said, I would now like to turn and ask my colleague, Michael Collins, if he could come and talk about the findings of this year's Global Terrorism Index and some of the really interesting findings that Canadians should be aware of. Michael?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kyle. Thank you very much for your attention. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, the organization that I work with, is actually most renowned for the Global Peace Index. It's a measure of peacefulness that covers 163 countries around the world. Now, within that, there's a whole series of indicators related to violent demonstrations, political terror, homicide, and of course, the impact of terrorism as one of those core indicators. Now, terrorism specifically is very important to incorporate because although instances of terrorism account for, 9 times less deaths than what we would see from conflict, or 45 times less deaths than what we would see from homicide worldwide, it nonetheless has a significant social impact and a geopolitical one as well. So just to take the case of the largest single terrorist attack this year, the Hamas attack in Israel on October 7th, we saw the immediate impact of the attack itself, 1,200 Israelis, the ongoing aftermath related to the Israeli response, in this instance 30,000 Palestinian civilians and Hamas militants killed. Broader political implications locally, so 3 weeks after the attack, polls showed that support for a two-state solution, for example, had dropped from 61% to 23% within Israel. And then broader geopolitical implications as well as to what countries are supporting who, and increased conflict and potential terrorism in the region more broadly. So tracking these trends in terrorism is tremendously important. In the Global Terrorism Index this year, we've seen a 22% increase in deaths from terrorism. One of the large drivers has been the single attack that I referred to before, although if we took that out, we're still seeing a 5% increase in terrorism deaths worldwide. Now, interestingly, the number of incidents worldwide has actually reduced. So we saw 50 out of 163 countries had a terrorist attack last year. 41 countries only had a terrorist death. Now, that's the lowest number of countries that we've seen since 2007, essentially when our data starts. So as a consequence of that, what we're seeing essentially is an increase of lethality of terrorism, as well as a concentration into a much smaller number of countries as well. So regionally speaking, although we've saw a significant attack in Israel, we've actually seen broader improvements in the region. Iraq continues to be somewhat of a standout, ongoing improvements in measures of terrorism there, 99% improvement since 2007 in that particular country. More farther afield in South Asia, we've seen improvements in Afghanistan. We have seen deteriorations in Pakistan, but the epicenter of terrorism has very much solidified, and we saw this transition already 4 or 5 years ago towards sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of overall deaths, now accounts for more deaths than the MENA region and South Asia combined. Most specifically within Sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel region, and within that, Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is currently the country most impacted by terrorism worldwide. It had 700 more deaths than in Israel over the last year, granted over, in this instance, over 500 different terrorist incidents in the country. More broadly speaking, within the Sahel, other countries continue to be significantly impacted, and terrorism continues to grow, including Niger, Nigeria. We've seen a small improvement in Mali, but the number of attacks continues to be significant. In relation to the West specifically, the West continues to form a very small subset of all of the terrorism that we are seeing worldwide. 23 incidents last year, 21 deaths. Most of those deaths were actually in the United States. Most of those political or ideological in nature, most of them tied to right-wing sympathies. Now, none of these were affiliated with a particular group. In terms of terrorist groups, we continue to see that the Islamic State is the most deadly organization worldwide. It became more deadly in Syria last year. It has presence throughout the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa, including as far as Mozambique and Uganda. JNIM, also a significant force. Both of these terrorist organizations killed more than 1,100 people over the last year, including in places such as Benin and Togo, who previously hadn't seen a lot of terrorism, at least in recent years. Both of those countries suffered more than 50 fatalities each. So JNIM is very much the one to watch in terms of overall growth. Al-Shabaab has seen some setbacks and the success of certain counterterrorism measures in Somalia. But again, the test of time will show. Organizations like Boko Haram continue to be considerably active as well. In closing, just a very quick note as it pertains to 2024, we do see ongoing risk of the expansion of terrorism within the Middle East region. We do see an ongoing solidification and increase in terrorism also within the Sahel, namely Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and neighboring countries, potentially more into coastal West Africa. And then to close, to recognize also that 50% of the world is going to be participating in a general election next year. So whereas we find it difficult to ascertain or see a direct pattern between elections and terrorism, terrorism does correlate very strongly with conflict, with violence, including things like violent demonstrations, for example, and also across the board, both in highly developed, underdeveloped, or economically prosperous countries and poorer countries, we see that the aggrievance as it pertains to people's rights is a fundamental driver of terrorism in many ways, whether your individual rights have been aggrieved or you perceive that other people's rights have been aggrieved. The Global Terrorism Index is available as a free download. You can access it safely and freely via our website. Just type 2024 Global Terrorism Index into any web browser. You'll also have a dynamic portal allowing you to be able to click on any country, see the individual indicators and the trends over time. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my dear colleague, Phil Gurski.
Thanks, Michael. So my name is Phil Gurski. I'm a retired analyst with CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, focusing on terrorism, and the author of 6 books on terrorism. First, I want to congratulate the IEP on an outstanding 2024 report. I've been following their material for quite some years. It is simply the best overall view of terrorism internationally. And as a Canadian, you might wonder, well, why do we here in Canada care? And for the reason that Michael cited, the conflict in Gaza, which is a direct result of the Hamas terrorist attack in October 7th of last year. Hamas is a listed terrorist entity here in Canada, has been for a long time, is having an impact here. We've had arrests here in Ottawa of people who wanted to carry out attacks against Jewish institutions, synagogues, cultural centers, in direct response to Israeli action in Gaza. We've had Hamas supporters here in Canada as well. And as Michael said, while people have the right to protest in Canada, it's a charter right. What our concerns are is that some of these protests may turn violent. In fact, we may have infiltration by people who are sympathetic to listed terrorist entities like Islamic State, like Hamas, like PFLP, et cetera. And I think what the Global Terrorism Index shows us is that internationally, when it comes to terrorist attacks and terrorist fatalities, the vast majority are still carried out globally by Islamist terrorists or jihadists. This is not to say the far right is not a concern. It clearly is, including here in Canada. But I think here in Canada, as both Michael and Kyle have indicated, we are a nation of diasporas. We're a nation of immigrants. And as a consequence, you often have violence that is perpetrated or inspired by what's happening outside of the country. As the conflict in Gaza continues, I think we would be prudent to expect more protests. some of which may inspire people to act violently. It's incumbent upon the Canadian government to ensure that our protectors, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the RCMP, et cetera, have the resources to do counterterrorism investigations, to stop these things before they happen. And it's important for us as an international player to lend our support to countries, as Michael said, and Kyle added, to help partners around the world deal with counterterrorism. We're thankfully here in Canada not immune from terrorism, but relatively safe from it. It doesn't happen here very often, but I think that we are part of a global community, and I think we have obligations to take in that regard. So let's not forget that terrorism is a threat. I know there are other national security priorities on the agenda now, whether it comes to Chinese interference, Russian interference, et cetera, but terrorism has not gone away. And thankfully, again, thanks to the IEP and the Global Terrorism Index, we now have a better picture of where terrorism is happening and what it means for us internationally. Thank you.
And in closing, I just want to say that there is a human rights impact of terrorism. We've talked about deaths and figures. Some of them might not seem as high as the war in Ukraine, but you look at waves of millions of people displaced in Africa, it creates a humanitarian disaster. And some of these states that are very weak need support to help their population, protect their civilians. And this is why the Global Terrorism Index is a must-read for anyone working in the human rights, security, or humanitarian sphere. If there are any questions, we'd be more than happy to take them.
Thank you. As of the moment, there is no question online and in the room, so that will conclude the press conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Lunchtime.